I didn't want to do it at first, and they'd been after me to do one for about 2 years. And I thought, well, you know, there's going to be 22,000 people there, so we can throw in some new songs maybe and everything. But as it turned out, we didn't, we played all old songs, and they just sort of stared at us. And it was a strange experience, really. It was about 6 months ago.
In my book, he was right there with Elvis.
When Ricky Nelson's plane went down in 1985, the world mourned the loss of a former teen idol, actor, and beloved singer who had grown up right in front of America's eyes. But while headlines focused on the tragic accident, few knew the financial storm brewing behind the scenes. On the surface, it looked like Ricky had died nearly penniless. He was in debt, had just gone through a painful divorce, and reports suggested he was struggling to book decent gigs. His lavish lifestyle, combined with a cooling career, had chipped away at his earnings. Family insiders whispered about unpaid taxes, loans from friends, and unpaid child support. His children, 4 in total, were bracing for the worst. Rumor had it that all he left behind were stacks of unpaid bills and emotional scars. The press even ran with headlines suggesting Ricky's legacy would be remembered more for his fall from grace than his golden boy years. But then something extraordinary happened. Ricky's brother David stumbled upon a will hidden in an old cabinet. It was handwritten, dated, and legally binding. What followed turned the entire story upside down. Lawyers began combing through Ricky's contracts, his record deals, his television royalties, and that's when the truth surfaced. Ricky had been systematically underpaid and manipulated by record companies for decades. A mountain of unpaid royalties, intellectual property rights, and residuals had quietly piled up. The discovery triggered a legal war that would ultimately transform his children into millionaires. Even the judge overseeing the settlement reportedly said he was stunned by how much had been stolen. It was one of the largest posthumous settlements in entertainment history. But the twist? One of his sons didn't get a single dime. The reason why would shake the family to its core. Ricky Nelson wasn't just a pop star he was born into. A media empire. From the moment he opened his eyes on May 8, 1940, in Teaneck, New Jersey, his life was already scripted for the spotlight. His father, Ozzie Nelson, was a well-known band leader, and his mother, Harriet Hilliard, had made a name for herself in Hollywood before settling into married life. Together, they launched The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. It's a radio show that would eventually transition into one of the most iconic television sitcoms of the 1950s. Ricky joined the cast at just 8 years old, and by the time most kids were learning cursive, he was memorizing scripts and signing autographs. Their real-life home at 1822 Camino Palmero in Los Angeles became the TV version too, blurring the line between fiction and reality. America fell in love with the idea of the perfect family, but behind the scenes, it was a business operation, run with military precision. Ozzie called the shots, and his sons, Ricky and David, were expected to deliver. Ricky's every move, from how he combed his hair to who he dated, was scrutinized, controlled, and packaged for public consumption. And yet, despite this intense structure, Ricky found a way to carve out his own identity. At 17, he performed "I'm Walking by Fats Domino Live on the Family Show." The reaction was electric. Teen girls across the country went wild. It was the perfect storm. A good-looking kid with a smooth voice. Already in America's living room every week, suddenly turning into a rock and roll sensation. Record companies came calling, and by the end of 1957, his debut single, Bebop, Baby, had already sold over 1 million copies. What most people didn't realize is that Ozzie, always thinking ahead, had brilliantly structured Ricky's TV appearances to double as marketing tools. Every episode ended with Ricky performing a new song. It was subtle product placement before that term even existed. By the early 1960s, Ricky had charted more than 30 top 40 hits, rivaling Elvis Presley himself in popularity and commercial power, but all of this success came at a cost. He was still a teenager, buried in contracts he didn't understand, and operating under the watchful eyes of both family and fame. That innocent smile America adored was often hiding a boy who felt trapped, as Ricky transitioned from teen idol to adult artist. The music industry was evolving, and so was he. He became restless. He wanted more creative control, more serious musicianship, and less interference from his father. But change came hard. Many session musicians looked down on him as a lightweight pop singer. Some flat out refused to play the way he wanted. One even told him, "Kid, this ain't music." That was the moment Ricky decided to build his own band. He hired young, hungry musicians who believed in his sound, guys like James Burton, who would later become a rock legend in his own right. This wasn't just about music. It was about taking ownership of his art. He began writing more, experimenting with country rock, and distancing himself from the slick, packaged image his parents had cultivated. He even dropped the Y from Ricky and rebranded as Rick Nelson, hoping the world would see him as a serious artist. It's Like Travelin' Man and Hello Mary Lou continued to bring in money, but something had shifted. Then came the British invasion. The Beatles changed everything. Overnight, the charts were flooded with a new sound and a new generation of stars. Rick struggled to keep up. The songs stopped climbing. Shows started drawing smaller crowds. The teen idol wave had crashed, and with it, so did much of his income. Yet even in these years, his music continued to be played. His face showed up in reruns, and his songs were licensed for commercials, films, and international markets. The money should have kept flowing. But Ricky, like many stars of his era, had signed contracts that favored the companies, not the artist. Labels found loopholes, misreported earnings, and held on to masters. It was only after his death that lawyers realized just how much had been siphoned away. Ricky's estate had decades of unpaid royalties, licensing fees, and residuals waiting to be claimed. The legal process was long and exhausting, but ultimately it paid off. His children, Tracy, Matthew, Gunnar, and Sam, were awarded millions in a multi-layered settlement that spanned several companies. They became guardians, not just of his music, but of his fortune. Ironically, the same system that bled him dry in life ended up enriching his heirs in death. But that wasn't the end of the story. One of Ricky's children was left out entirely. The reason why it would open old wounds the family still hasn't healed. Ricky's marriage, too. Kristen Harmon's sister of actor Mark Harmon and daughter. A football legend, Tom Harmon, was one of the most talked about unions in 1960s Hollywood. On paper, they were a dream couple. Two beautiful, famous young people from high-profile families. But the reality was darker. Their relationship was tumultuous from the start. Kristen came from money and expected a lifestyle to match. Rick, who had grown up under his father's frugal watch, tried to meet those expectations, but he wasn't ready for the constant spending, the demands, the emotional whiplash. They married in 1963 after a shotgun proposal. Kristen was already pregnant, and her Catholic parents insisted on a formal, fast-tracked wedding. Rick, who wasn't Catholic, had to take religious classes and agreed to raise his children in the church. Behind the scenes, it was less about love and more about damage control. Kristen even joined Rick on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, playing herself and adding another layer to their already blurred lines between life and fiction. For a while, the dual income helped sustain their image, but neither of them knew how to budget. They didn't save, they spent. Lavish homes, expensive vacations, custom wardrobes, and a parade of assistants drained their bank accounts. As Rick's music career stalled in the 70s, the pressure mounted. He started touring again, not because he loved it, but because he had to. Kristen wanted him home. He needed the money. The resentment festered. Their marriage dissolved in 1982 in a brutal divorce that cost Rick over $1 million in cut, deep into what little he had left. But that wasn't the worst of it. After Rick died, tensions within the family exploded. His youngest son, Sam, who was just a child at the time, became the center of controversy. The other children, Tracy, Matthew, and Gunnar, were named in the estate and received significant inheritances after the settlements came through. Sam, however, was excluded. The reasons were messy. Some say it was a clerical error tied to Rick's outdated will. Others suggest legal battles with Kristen, who had custody of Sam, played a role. Either way, the youngest Nelson boy grew up hearing stories about the fortune his father left behind, but never received his share. For years, the issue simmered quietly. Today, Sam is an artist in his own right, And while he doesn't speak publicly about the estate, close friends say he's never fully let go of the hurt. It's a painful reminder that even in death, fame can divide a family as easily as it builds one. Ricky Nelson may have left behind millions, but what he couldn't leave behind was the complicated, beautiful, and sometimes bitter legacy that still haunts those who loved him. The film Love and Kisses was supposed to be lighthearted, but behind the scenes, it was anything but. While critics at the time thought it was clever to cast Rick and Kristen Nelson in roles that mirrored their real-life relationship, no one realized just how eerily close the movie hit to home. Rick played a high schooler even though he was already 25, and Kristen's performance was largely forgettable. Off-screen, their marriage was unraveling, but Rick's father, Ozzy, insisted on using the movie to explore themes that reflected private family drama. What audiences got was a strange and uncomfortable experience. Something that felt more like a therapy session turned into a screenplay than entertainment. The camera might have been rolling, but what it captured wasn't fiction. Of the 1960s, Rick was growing desperate to shed the skin of his past and finally step out from under the shadow of his early fame. He formed the Stone Canyon Band, determined to mix country with rock long before it became fashionable, recruiting future Eagles bassist Randy Meisner in the process. The band had promise, but financially, it was a nightmare. Rick had gone from playing packed concert halls to scraping by in small clubs for almost no pay. Meisner eventually quit, saying the gigs weren't worth it. Rick pushed forward anyway, releasing albums like Rick Sings Nelson and In Concert, both of which were critically appreciated but commercial failures. He was chasing artistic integrity while his fame and fortune disintegrated. Then came the moment that would crush him emotionally. On October 15, 1971, Rick performed at Madison Square Garden in a rock and roll revival concert. He showed up expecting love from the crowd, but what he got instead was a harsh reminder that the world had moved on. He had rebranded himself, even dropping the Y from Ricky to mark a new musical chapter, and when he played Honky Tonk Women, the crowd booed. Some blamed police action and tension in the stands, but Rick took it personally. He believed the audience wanted the old version of him, not the new. Humiliated, he left the stage and watched the rest of the show from the wings before finally returning to play the hits only, then earning polite applause. That night cut deep, but from that pain came a song that would define his resilience. In 1972, Rick released Garden Party, a reflective anthem about that night and the pressure of living up to an image. Its chorus, "You can't please everyone, so you gotta please yourself," resonated deeply with listeners. The single reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and went gold, giving Rick his first top 10 hit in nearly a decade. For a brief moment, he was back, but lightning didn't strike twice. Follow-up tracks like Palace Guard failed to chart, and albums such as Windfall flopped. Record labels didn't know what to do with him. He started playing at amusement parks and taking minor TV roles to pay the bills. Eventually, even MCA dropped him. Garden Party became both his comeback and his quiet farewell. By the mid-1970s, the golden boy of American pop was losing everything. His marriage to Kristen was in tatters, held together only by a facade, while Rick toured non-stop trying to support their extravagant lifestyle. Private schools, luxury properties, and an endless stream of expenses were draining him dry. The more he worked, the more he distanced himself emotionally. Kristen, feeling abandoned, began lashing out. Their conversations dissolved into arguments. Their once charmed life turned bitter. In 1977, after a grueling tour, Rick returned home, expecting a reunion, but instead found himself locked out. Kristen had moved all his belongings into a rental home, and to his shock, was inside with 2 Los Angeles Rams cheerleaders. She claimed it was for the children's benefit, blaming Rick's alleged drug use. Rick denied the accusations, but the marriage was clearly over. In one last attempt at reconciliation, Rick bought Errol Flynn's former mansion on Mulholland Drive for $750,000, hoping it could be a new beginning. But Kristen insisted he quit music and become a full-time actor. That wasn't possible. Rick was drowning in debt, and needed the money from touring to survive. The mansion quickly became a burden. Lights flickered, strange noises haunted the halls, and financial strain loomed over them like a ghost. Even the dream home became a symbol of collapse. Their divorce turned vicious. Kristen accused Rick of drug use and being unfit to raise their children, even saying they could die if she stayed with him. Rick countered with claims of alcohol abuse and neglect. The legal war dragged on for 5 years and consumed over $1 million in legal fees. By 1982, it was finally over. Rick was ordered to pay $4,000 a month in child support and given joint custody of his 4 children, who ranged in age from 8 to 19, but the legal battle had gutted him. Emotionally wrecked and nearly bankrupt, he toured constantly. Just to make ends meet, his health suffered, his spirit dimmed. The joy he once felt for music was buried beneath exhaustion and regret. By 1985, Rick was clinging to one last hope, a comeback. But he had one major problem: he hated flying. Still determined to save money and avoid the grind of tour buses, Rick bought a 1944 Douglas DC-3 for $118,000, a vintage plane that had once belonged to Jerry Lee Lewis. He thought it would give him privacy and flexibility. Instead, it became a death trap. The plane was falling apart. Engines misfired, parts failed mid-flight, and the band once had to push it off the runway. His guitarist's wife begged him not to fly on it. His bassist had already survived too. Emergency landings. Even his pianist wanted off. He was broke, exhausted, and couldn't afford to cancel shows. In September, mechanical issues caused him to miss a major televised event. Then came December 31st. The plane was grounded for hours due to yet another engine fault. Still, Rick insisted they fly to Dallas for a New Year's Eve concert. Somewhere over Texas, the cabin filled with smoke so thick that the pilots couldn't see their instruments. The lead pilot had to stick his head out the window just to navigate. At 5:14 p.m., the plane crashed in a field just 2 miles from the landing strip near DeKalb. Witnesses saw it trailing smoke, flying low and unevenly. Before hitting trees and exploding into flames, the crash scattered debris over 150 yards. Only the pilots survived, escaping through cockpit windows. Everyone else, including Rick, was killed in the inferno. He was just 45. His fiancée Helen Blair, his pianist Andy Chapin, his drummer. Rick and Veld guitarist Bobby Neal, bassist Patrick Woodward, and soundman Donald Clark Russell all died in the crash. It was so horrific that some of the victims had to be identified by autopsy. The world was stunned. Ricky Nelson, the sweet-faced boy America had watched grow up, was gone. And the chaos that followed would be just as tragic as his death.